And this one, especially, you may want to make sure that you give yourself a healthy 1/2 inch. That doesn't mean 3/4 of an inch, it just means a real real 1/2 inch. So not shy, you know, really make sure that when you're sewing, you're actually using the edge of the fabric and not the fringe of the fabric. I was noticing a few of you guys were actually lining up with these little hairs. Use the actual, you know, edge of the fabric. So a real 1/2 inch is what we need. Okay, so it should be about that much. And the reason I say make sure you give yourself enough space is because we're actually going to be sewing a whole piece onto this space here. We want to make sure that we give ourselves enough room to actually work around it. So you're going to go and you're going to press this open, and I'm going to fake press it with my fingernails, but you guys use the real iron. And again, iron from both sides. And then we're going to take our bias binding and we're actually going to wrap it around that, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. You can sew with the long piece of the bias binding, or you can cut it, but because it's bias, it's a little stretchy. Sometimes before binding something, you actually take some of that stretch out. So you can go over to the ironing board. I'm not going to bring it over there to show you just because I don't want to distract you, but you put some needles in like this onto the ironing board, and then you pull and iron it, and that presses it and kind of solidifies it a little bit so that it's not too stretchy. Sometimes you want the stretch, sometimes you don't. So for this, you can practice that if you want. It's not absolutely necessary, but it's up to you. So again, you cannot rip the bias strips. If there's ripped edges, you haven't done the bias right. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna take one side of this bias binding, or sorry, this seam allowance. Just pick one, you're gonna do both, so it doesn't matter which one. And you're going to line up your bias strip on top of that, and you're going to put everything else towards the other side. So your other seam allowance and your 2 pieces of garment fabric are going to be away from that. And we're going to just sew this on at 1/4 of an inch, and again, a real 1/4 of an inch, but don't have to be, you know, just do a real 1/4, not thin, not thick. All the way to the end. I'm going to trim this off now just because I know, and I can trim off the extra when I'm all finished. Doesn't matter how you really do that. I'm going to take this over to my ironing board, and I'm going to press everything towards the bias strip. I'm going to then fold this over so that it meets with that edge. So it should be 1/4 of an inch that you're folding over, and then I'm going to fold it over again. It's kind of another burrito situation, so that edge, when you press this over, is going to just cover that seam allowance, that stitch that you just did. So you shouldn't be able to see it, but you don't want to go too far. You should have 1/4 of an inch or so of bias binding and 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance showing, just like that. And here's my sample finished. So I'm going to go press this, and I'll be right back. Alright, so as you can see, I have pressed it over 2 times, so that basically what you have is your garment and your other seam allowance is all towards this one side. You're only dealing with one side of your seam allowance at a time, and you're just wrapping that edge in this bias binding. So you're sewing it on, and then you're just wrapping it around it, and that's that. And then the last step is going to be to top stitch that down. Now, there are two ways to do this. So I'm going to do this side one way, and then I'm going to do the other side another way. One side is going to be top stitch on the edge, but the other side I'm going to actually do this technique called stitch in the ditch. Has anybody heard of that before? Yes. Stitching in the ditch means that you're going to actually sew in the groove of a seam line that is already there, and what that does is it hides the stitch and also makes it so if I've pressed this correctly, so it's just over that stitching line, if I stitch right on that stitching line on here through stitching in the groove and hiding it, then it'll be just on the edge perfectly. I'm cheating by doing it like this, but because this is a Hong Kong seam, I don't really care. There will be other opportunities for you to try the stitch in the ditch, but it is a good thing to get used to, because at other times there may be points when you actually use that technique. So stitching on the edge right here is one option, and that gives you a little bit of control, but it doesn't give you as much control as to how that side's going to look. So if you had a garment or a part of a garment that you wanted the stitching to be totally hidden, you would stitch in the ditch rather than on the top side, rather than stitching on the edge like I did. So again, now that I'm done with this side, I'm going to flip everything away, push that finished side away, and I'm only going to deal with my seam allowance. Then I'm going to take my bias binding, I'm going to line it up on the edge, and if you have diagonal cuts, just make sure that you kind of push that away more, because if you line it up here and then try and wrap it around, you're going to be a little short. Not the end of the world for a sample, but could end up being annoying for a final finished garment. So again, I'm going to stitch at 1/4 inch in my seam allowance. And you can pin this. I'm not pinning just, because I have bad habits. I'm then going to press this all towards the bias binding. So everything is like you're packing the burrito now. You're putting all the stuff in it. And then you're going to fold this over once and meet it up with the edge. So it should be 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch of the seam allowances, and then you're going to fold it over again. So one more time, I'll be right back. If your bias binding is too wide, you may trim away any of this stuff inside. It's all going to get, covered up anyway. So if it's too bulky and you're worried about it, you can trim away the bias itself, because you really only want that bias to be 1/4 inch. Or you can trim away your extra seam allowance in here if you happen to have a little bit too much bulk. So can anybody sort of guess what maybe the Hong Kong seam would be good for? Yes, Christian. Right. If a jacket is not lined and you want to close off all your seams so that when you look, my jacket is lined, so it's not, and this is not a Hong Kong seam, it's just a detail, but if you didn't want to have this lining in here, you could seal off all those seams. You'll see it sometimes. I feel like they do it a lot at J. Crew and places like that. And a lot of times there'll be like contrast colors, and it can be really cute. But the reason I like to do the Hong Kong seam is because this technique of wrapping things and stitching and folding and doing that comes up in collars and cuffs and all these different places. So this technique, even though it's tiny here, does end up in a lot of stuff. So the stitch in the ditch is what it sounds like. Basically, you're going to, instead of stitching from the side that you folded over, you're going to make sure that that's all set, and again, fold it over just past that seam line that you had made, okay? And you're going to stitch in the little groove as best you can, and I'm using contrast thread, so it's a little bit harder to really see how hidden this can be. You don't want to stitch on the actual fold. you want to stitch in the groove or the ditch, hence the name. And the problem with this is that you can't quite always be sure that you're actually catching the other side. So when you're done, you have to check and make sure. I did happen to catch the whole fold because I pressed it really carefully, but if you happen to fall off one of those edges, you can always go back and do it again. But essentially you're doing the exact same thing. It's just that, as you can see, this side, if this was a matching thread, you wouldn't really see it at all, or this side it's a little bit more obvious that I've sewn on that. For the Hong Kong seam, it doesn't matter which way you do it, but for things like cuffs and collars, it might become a little bit more apparent. So that is our finished Hong Kong seam. Does anybody have any questions about that? All right, let's give it a try.